In our last video, when I gave a preview of the entire season, I talked about how each of the Seattle Philharmonic's concerts this year has a number 4 something in it. At our opening concert of the season, we featured the 4th symphonic poem by Franz Liszt, Orpheus. At our second concert, we had the 4th horn concerto by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. For the upcoming concert, we're going to conclude with the 4th Symphony by Robert Schumann, about which I'll speak in a bit. Before intermission, we have another major United States premiere, this time the Suite for Orchestra by Rosa Garcia Ascot, a Spanish composer from the 20th century who lived to the ripe old age of 100. If you're fond of the piano music of Enrique Granados, if you like the music of Manuel de Falla, if you like the Spanish neo-romantic music of Joaquin Rodrigo, this piece is for you. Following the Ascot, we're going to have music of Niccolò Paganini, his first violin concerto, as stunningly played by the winner of the Philharmonic's Don Buchel competition last year, Mr. Tokuji Miyasaka. And then after intermission, the Schumann Symphony. Funny thing about Schumann, he's kind of like Handel in that I think when most knowledgeable music lovers compile a list of the 10 or 12 greatest composers, Schumann and Handel eventually make it onto the list, and yet the bulk of both of their output is virtually unknown. When we speak of Handel, people go, oh, Messiah, the fireworks music, the water music, and here's a man who wrote hundreds of pieces. Well, similarly, Schumann, who didn't live as long as Handel, nonetheless had a substantial output, but we don't know a lot of it as intimately as we do some of the other great Romantic composers, Mendelssohn, Brahms, certainly Gustav Mahler. And it's a shame because Schumann truly was a great composer, and in this symphony, his 4th, he managed a fusion of ecstasy and intimacy with such tight formal structure. It is an endlessly fascinating piece of music. It's in 4 movements, and each movement somehow feeds off at least another of the movements. All the movements are bound together by thematic materials. One example would be the main theme of the first movement, after a very, very brooding, slow introduction, is announced by the first violins. It's very hefty, and so on. Cut to the last movement. The last movement is opens with a very chordal, fanfare-like theme. Okay. And in between those chords, the cellos and basses have these skittish little asides. I'm going to slow them down a little bit. So you hear what they're doing? They're going, which is a variation of. It's very creative recycling. There's another aspect of Schumann that is interestingly downplayed by a lot of interpreters. I know a lot of people say, I don't like dissonance. Well, dissonance is a mainstay of music. And I think what people mean when they say that is they don't like dissonance piled upon dissonance. But when a dissonance is introduced and resolves, that exquisite little moment of poignancy is so rich. And it's all over Schumann. And I've heard a lot of interpretations of his songs, of his symphonies, of his chamber music, where people back off from these dissonances. And it's a shame, because that's part and parcel of what makes Schumann such an incredible composer. One example of that occurs in the first movement. And I always love showing what a composer could have done, but what they actually did. There's this achingly beautiful theme in the first movement, which Schumann could have written like this. And so on. But listen to what he did. He did this. And for that one moment, it's like, and then when he finally resolves it, that's the beauty of Schumann. And I hope you can come and share in this celebration of his beautiful music. I want to conclude with a story. This is probably one of my half-dozen favorite anecdotes in all of classical music. And I told this story to the Philharmonic the night of the first rehearsal of Schumann's Fourth. And I said to them, I want this to be as much of what shapes your interpretation of this piece as the notes themselves. Schumann was a brilliant man, fantastically huge intellect, and in some ways they say he was kind of a man-child. He was the quintessential absent-minded professor. He lived very much in his own preoccupied world. They said that he would go to his favorite diner and sometimes he'd walk out without paying and other times he'd put down enough money for 2 lunches, and eventually the owner started sending the bills to his wife because Schumann was unreliable about paying accurately. And all of Schumann's friends understood this about him. They realized that he was a fragile, gentle soul. So my favorite story is that one day one of his good friends was at his own lodging, and a messenger came to the door with a message from Schumann. Please come to my house. I need to see you immediately. And his friend thought, oh gosh, he's having a meltdown. His friend dropped everything he was doing, ran over to Schumann's house, and he sat in Schumann's parlor waiting for him. Schumann eventually came in, took his friend by the shoulders and said, thank you so much for coming. And Schumann sat down. And this long silence ensued, and Schumann's friend kept waiting for the explosion. 5 minutes went by, 10 minutes went by, and finally, at the end of a half an hour, Schumann stood up, again embraced his friend, said, thank you for being here when I needed you, and walked out. He just needed that person there. That was what he needed. That's the man himself.